Zach, am I good to go?
Yes.
Great. Hello and good afternoon, everyone, or good morning, depending on where you're joining us from. For today's event, 1 year later, understanding the impacts of COVID on small businesses and what they need for an equitable recovery. My name is Awesta Sarkash. I'm the Government Affairs Manager at Small Business Majority. Before I turn it over to John Arnsmeyer, a few housekeeping items. The event is closed to press. It is going to be recorded. To our panelists, we ask you to mute yourselves when you're not speaking to avoid any audio issues. And then, of course, make sure to unmute yourself when you're responding to a question. And finally, for our participants, thank you for joining us. And if you have questions for our panelists, please feel free to share them in the chat and we'll do our best to answer them. And with that, I'll turn it over to you, John.
Thank you, Awesta, and thank you all for joining us today. Briefly, I'm just going to give a brief summary about Small Business Majority before I introduce our keynote speaker. As many of you know, we've been around for 15 years. We have a national network of over 85,000 small business owners. We have eight offices across the country. And we have partnerships with over 1,000 business and other organizations, many of whom are represented on this event today. We do extensive advocacy at the national level, but also at the state level. We have a very extensive program of education and connection with resources to small business owners. And as we're going to talk about today, we do a lot of research into small business needs and their circumstances and potential policy solutions. I should add, we focus on the smallest businesses and particularly under-resourced communities, and especially those owned by people of color and women. As you're all aware, we're just past the 1 year mark of the first shutdowns from the COVID-19 pandemic. And from day one of the pandemic, small businesses have been hurting. They've had to continuously adapt to this unprecedented event while navigating ever-changing relief programs. Throughout the pandemic, we have researched the fortunes of small businesses, as have the partner organizations you'll be hearing from today. And this research, along with the real stories of small business owners, have been critical to understanding what the small business community has endured and where we need to go. Specifically, this research is guiding us to understand how a small business has fared, or not for that matter, in acquiring relief dollars. Very importantly, what are the disparities we see, and among whom? What patterns do we see in the data? And finally, what can we all do to ensure small businesses are truly on the road to recovery? I have to say, the only silver lining in this pandemic has been to underscore the importance of small business to our economy and to the lives within our most vulnerable communities, something I don't think was as well understood prior to the pandemic than it is now. With the recently passed American Rescue Plan, the recently proposed American Jobs Plan, and the soon-to-be announced American Families Plan, we have an opportunity to implement tangible policy solutions to ensure that our nation's businesses can truly rebuild better. So with that, I'd like to introduce our keynote speaker, Congressman Hakeem Jeffries. Congressman Jeffries represents the 8th Congressional District of New York, an area that encompasses large parts of Brooklyn and a section of Queens. He's the chairman of the House Democratic Caucus, making him the 5th highest ranking Democrat in the House of Representatives. He also serves on the House Judiciary and Budget Committees. Congressman Jeffries has been a tireless advocate for social and economic justice. He's worked hard to help residents and small businesses impacted by the devastation of the COVID-19 pandemic, reform our criminal justice system, improve the economy for everyday Americans, and protect our health care. Specifically, he's fought hard to support state and local governments, push for an extension of emergency unemployment benefits, and supported efforts to keep everyday Americans in their homes. Prior to his election to Congress, Representative Jeffries served for 6 years in the New York State Assembly, where he authored laws to protect the civil liberties of law-abiding New Yorkers during police encounters, encourage the transformation of vacant luxury condominiums into affordable homes, and improve the quality of justice in the civil court system. I also want to add that we really appreciate being invited to present at his 2021 Democratic Caucus Issues Conference. My colleague, Xiomara Pena, who you're going to meet shortly, was very honored to present at that, and really appreciate your soliciting our opinions and views. So with that, welcome Congressman Jeffries.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Good morning to those who may be out on the West Coast. Thank you, John, for your leadership and for that very generous introduction, for the work that you do. And it's good to see you, Ziamara. We're so thankful for your participation in the 2021 House Democratic Issues Conference, to Awesta and to all of the members of Small Business Majority, as well as all of those panelists participating in this program, and to those who are viewing, and small business owners from throughout the country. It's an honor to have the opportunity to share a few words. I'm going to try and follow the advice of a former Sunday school teacher of mine, who on the question of public speaking once said to me, "Jeffries, always remember, be brief, be bright, and be gone." So I'm going to try to not tarry for too long, but I do want to share a few thoughts on the occasion 1 year later, as we've navigated our way through this pandemic, and the importance of small businesses and how we can sustain you and make sure you can thrive as we emerge. It's often been said that there's nothing more American than motherhood, baseball, and apple pie. I would amend that statement to say motherhood, baseball, apple pie, and small businesses. Because at the end of the day, when you think about the qualities of a small business owner, entrepreneurship, ingenuity, creativity, hard work, that's exactly what Americana has always been about in its purest form. We know, of course, that this is a great country. We've come a long way. We still have a long way to go. We have to deal with issues of systemic racism as it impacts the entire society, and certainly its impact on women and minority-owned small business entrepreneurs. But in its purest form, the notion of entrepreneurship and hard work and innovation and creativity is what America is all about, what small businesses are all about. And the contract in America has always been that if you work hard and play by the rules, you should be able to provide a comfortable living for yourself and for your families. And I think that in many ways is part of the importance of small business entrepreneurship, but not all of it, because you are such an important, integral, connective tissue in our communities, particularly traditionally disadvantaged communities and communities of color. And this pandemic has been devastating and brought a lot of pain and suffering and death in so many ways to so many people throughout the land. And it has devastated small businesses. We know more than 100,000 small businesses have permanently closed, and many more have been adversely impacted by this pandemic. As John indicated, the silver lining has been, and I've seen this in Congress, that there's a heightened recognition of the importance of small businesses as it relates to our economy and the fabric of our society. There was always lip service paid to the importance of small businesses. That notion was always articulated, but now I think it's felt in a much more meaningful and deeper way. And we've tried to breathe in to the principle of standing up for small businesses, particularly those owned by people of color and women, the entities that the small business majority works hard to lift up. And that's why we made an adjustment very early on in the pandemic when we saw that the first round of the Paycheck Protection Program funds weren't necessarily going to the women and minority-owned businesses, the family-owned businesses, the small mom and pop shops on the boulevard or in Main Street in Middle America, who we wanted to lift up. And that's why one of the adjustments we made was to redirect some of the funding from the traditional banks to community development financial institutions, as well as women and minority-owned banks and community banks who have a much better track record of getting small businesses the capital and resources you need to continue to pursue your entrepreneurial goals, dreams, and objectives. And that was an important change that passed Congress in a bipartisan way, but certainly was lifted up by people within the House Democratic majority. And we will continue to push for that level of reinvestment and recognition. That not all small businesses or not all businesses can be treated the same, and that we have to lean in to lifting up small businesses in a particular way, recognizing your needs, the funding streams that we need to make available to you are going to be different than perhaps the traditional routes in order to ensure that you can get the access to capital and resources necessary to emerge from this pandemic much stronger than you went into the pandemic. Because after all, President Biden has said the goal is to build back better, not return to normal prior to the pandemic, but to build back better. And that's exactly what we intend to do. Lastly, I'll say I know this has been a tough time. I'm reminded of the moment where some young people were gathered at the home of one of the wealthiest people in the world. They were at this estate, and they're on one side of a big lake that's in the center of this estate. And in this lake, there are crocodiles and alligators, one small turtle. The owner of the estate shows up. He's on the other side of the lake, sees these young people. This owner is one of the wealthiest people in the world. He calls out to them on the other side, says, if any of you can jump in the lake, rescue the turtle, and make it to the other side, I'll give you anything that you want in this world. The folks on the other side didn't respond. About 5 minutes passed by and they were silent. And so the owner of the estate turns around and begins to walk away. And as he's walking away, all of a sudden, he hears a big splash, turns around, sees one young person in the lake, frantically trying to make it to the other side. The young person dodges the crocodiles and the alligators, makes it to the middle, scoops up the turtle, continues to bob and weave, makes it somehow to the other side, gets out, dries off, hands over the turtle to the owner of the estate, who says, I don't know how you did it, but you made it to the other side. Now, as I promised, I'll give you anything that you want in this world. And the owner of the estate looked, and the young person paused for a moment, said, well, I just want to know who pushed me in the lake. What am I trying to say? Sometimes you find yourself in the moment of unexpected adversity. That's exactly what happened 1 year ago. The pandemic strikes and the shutdown takes place. Your business is unexpectedly interrupted, thrust into a very difficult time. Unexpected adversity, once in a century pandemic. But when you find yourself in a moment of unexpected adversity, you've only got two options. You can either sink or you can swim. And I'm confident that all of you have the strength, the resilience, the capacity, the ability, the work ethic, the ingenuity, all of those qualities so central to the American dream to survive this pandemic. We're going to be with you every step of the way. Make sure that you make it to the other side. And when you do, emerge stronger than ever. So thank you, John, for giving me an opportunity to share a few opening remarks, and look forward to being supportive of all of you and Small Business Majority as you move forward.
John, you're on mute.
Thanks, Congressman Jeffries. Do you have time to take a couple of questions? We have some questions that people have been sending in.
Yes, I do.
Sure. So one of them is just, are there programs right now that you'd like the group to know about that are essential to long-term recovery of small businesses, particularly those owned by people of color? Yeah, so one of the things that the Biden administration has indicated they are looking forward to working with us in the Congress on
is ensuring a fair and equitable and just recovery with a focus on making sure that traditionally left behind communities, communities of color, rural communities, communities in small town America, certainly in inner city America, immigrant communities, can participate in the investments that the federal government will be making. That in fact is going to be the case as it relates to both the American Jobs Plan, where they have indicated at least 40% of the investment will be targeted toward these communities. And within that basket, we're working with the administration to make sure that lifting up entrepreneurship and small businesses of color, women-owned businesses, will be an important part of that type of investment that is being set aside for reasons of ensuring an equitable recovery. As you also indicated, John, we'll see the outlines of the American Families Plan at some point, and we're going to want to make sure that there's an integrated approach to lifting up families. As I indicated earlier, you know, small businesses are such an important part of the fabric of our communities. Family-owned businesses would logically be part of an American Families Plan. And I think, you know, the administration has indicated they're open to ideas, that they're not locked in on specifics, but they are locked in on the goal. And the goal is to make sure that traditionally left behind parts of our economy, including those most importantly that the small business majority serves, will be an important part of their revitalization and recovery efforts. Secretary Yellen made that clear to us as House Democrats just a few days ago. And she also said consistently, she wants ideas. And so I extend that opportunity to you, John, and to all of you in terms of how you envision what a fair and equitable recovery should look like. And we look forward to working together to bring that to life.
Along those lines, specifically, what can you share with the groups that are on this call, on this meeting, about what they can do to help support your efforts as we go through this year, considering the American Jobs Plan, the American Families Plan, et cetera?
Yeah, I think what's going to be important is that, you know, you continue to identify your members of Congress, your United States senators, and stress the importance of making sure that an emphasis on small business success continue to be a part of our legislative agenda. As we move from relief and rescue to recovery and revitalization, small businesses were centered in ways that we've talked about as part of the relief and rescue, from the CARES Act through the supplemental legislation that passed last April, which is where we made the switch to emphasizing community development, financial institutions, women-owned banks, minority-owned banks, to try to make sure that small businesses, such as those on the call, actually receive the assistance and the resources that we intended, and they don't just go to well-connected traditional institutions. And I think emphasizing that type of approach, if you agree that's what's necessary for us to move forward, should continue in your communications with your members of Congress, public policymakers at all levels of government, and certainly your U.S. senators, I think will be important, because your advocacy efforts, your voices have already laid that foundation. We've already gone down a different lane out of specific recognition that certain businesses and entrepreneurs have certain needs, and that traditional approaches were failing to meet those needs. And so I think doubling and tripling down on that emphasis, which is the focus of what Small Business Majority does, I think is going to receive a receptive ear. but it's important to sustain the advocacy because there will be so many other groups that are going to articulate a perspective on what revitalization should look like.
Well, thank you for that. And thank you so much for joining us today. And thank you so much for your leadership. We really appreciate everything you and your colleagues are doing, which is a lot, and there's a lot that needs to be done. And we look forward to collectively working with you to move everything forward this year and beyond. So thanks again.
Thanks so much, John. Thank you, everyone, for having me on, and look forward to continuing to work together. Stay safe.
Okay. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to our Vice President of Engagement, Xiomara Pena.
Thank you, John. Thank you again for Congressman Jeffries for that dynamic discussion and your ongoing leadership supporting the small business community. As John mentioned, I'm the Vice President of Engagement here at Small Business Majority. See a lot of familiar names in the chat box, so feel free to again put your name, organization, what city or state you're tuning in from. I'm really excited to be moderating our first panel, which will focus on data and will feature small business voices as well. So critical to all of the work that we have been leading over the last year. Throughout the pandemic, research and real stories of small business owners have shed a light on what the small business community has endured and the disproportionate impacts of communities of color, as John and Congressman Jeffries referenced. I'm going to briefly introduce our panelists, and then we'll jump right into the questions. First, I'm joined by Brian Pfeiffer. He is the Vice President of Entrepreneurship here at Small Business Majority. Brian oversees Small Business Majority's entrepreneurship program, our venturize.org platform, which also delivers key information and resources to entrepreneurs seeking to start or grow their businesses. Brian has also expanded our research work over the last year, leveraging our systems in order to be able to capture timely data from the small business community. Also joining us, we have Anna Marie Cruz representing ICIC, where she serves as the Western Regional Manager for the Inner City Capital Connections team. Prior to joining ICIC, Anna Marie Cruz was a community loan officer at CDC Small Business Finance, a leading mission-based lender and business counselor at Asian Pacific Islander Small Business Program. Next up, we have Jennifer De Silva, founder and executive director of Start Small, Think Big, an organization we're excited to partner with on collaborative research project recently, who has been doing critical work, providing legal support and other technical assistance for micro small business owners in deeply impacted communities. Also joining us is Chris Wheat, co-president of JPMorgan Chase Institute. Prior to joining JPMCI, he served as the director of analytics at a financial technology startup where he led the development advanced analytics algorithm. The Institute publishes original research to help policymakers, business, and nonprofit leaders make more informed decisions. They've captured insights on the economic impacts of COVID-19, household income and spending, small business cash flow management, and overall health and healthcare, and a wide range of topics. Had a chance to review some of the research in advance of today's panel, and just really thankful for all of the good work that you're all doing. We're also joined today by Renard Beaty, or should I call you Master Beaty? Renard is a 5th degree Black Belt owner and chief instructor at Kickstart Martial Arts in Atlanta, Georgia. He joined our network last year, and he will be able to share with us his experience that he had in obtaining funding and having to pivot, and the needs that still exist for small businesses like his. And our second business owner that will be joining us for this panel, it joins us from Los Angeles. She is the owner of not one, not two, but 4 establishments: Legacy Full Circle Financial Insurance Services, 3 different restaurant bars, the Empire Tavern, Nativo Bar Fino, and my personal favorite, House of Chelas, located in Boyle Heights. Corissa is the daughter of Mexican immigrants. She began her career as a middle school teacher, then was inspired to fill the gaps for her community and opened 3 craft beer businesses in just 4 years, establishing herself as one of the few female forces in a predominantly male industry. Out of respect of time, we will be asking speakers to be concise and prompt in their responses to allow for others to chime in. We expect this panel to explore a range of topics, and I think we should just jump right in. So I'm going to start with you, Anna Marie. Toward the start of the pandemic, ICIC released its interactive map showing the economic vulnerability of neighborhoods across the country. Can you highlight for us the key findings from that map and how you have seen these vulnerability businesses you work with over the past year? And welcome again.
Thank you. Thank you so much for including us and for allowing us to share some of these insights, and also for your tremendous partnership over the year, especially in responding to a lot of the immediate needs in navigating various resources throughout the country. So we developed an interactive map really to help provide actionable neighborhood level information to local policymakers and also technical assistance providers to basically target the type of interventions that they would be able to implement and address a lot of the long-term sources of these vulnerabilities. And we can advance to the next slide. And so we estimated that so here's why we created this, and we can move on to the next one too. So we estimated the vulnerability of more than 70,000 neighborhoods across the country and all 50 states to really in terms of the economic crisis resulting from the pandemic. And this was based on 5 key things: the percent of residents that are employed in the most highly affected industries. And at the time, just keep in mind that this was at the beginning of the pandemic. So we made some educated guesses or educated decisions on which industries these would be. And then we also looked at the percentage of residents who do not have access to a vehicle, which affects their mobility, of the percent of residents who do not have internet access, the percent of residents who are also housing cost burdened, meaning they're paying more than 30% of their income related to housing, and then also those who do not have health insurance. So we gave different weighted points to these vulnerabilities, and we can move on to the next slide. What we found is that high poverty areas with 20% or higher poverty rates are most economically vulnerable, and economic vulnerability is concentrated in neighborhoods of color. Not a surprise, but seeing that in data, of course, further justifies a lot of the interventions that we would need. And then also among high poverty neighborhoods, neighborhoods of color are also most vulnerable. And then in terms of, I think, Ziomara, you're also asking about what we saw with the businesses that we served and what are some of the indicators of successful responses, right? So what we actually saw is, while entrepreneurs, of course, are very resilient, innovative, and creative, we recognized very early on that expanding access to resources and training and community would be critical to ensuring their survivability. So for us, in terms of our programs, we expanded our physical geographic coverage. We also relaxed our requirements for our capacity building programs. And then what we heard from business owners were, in terms of access to technical assistance, and again, funding and also community were so important. And then there were also additional concerns that were emerging in terms of retaining employees, whether it was related to the health concerns, but also related to what we then saw was, closures of other institutions such as schools. So I'll pause there. I'm sure you have other questions to follow up.
Thanks. Thank you so much. And that map, I think, has been an incredible tool to look at in terms of, again, identifying some of the levers and resources that certain communities will need. Thanks, Anna Marie. Jennifer, I want to turn to you. You've been conducting ongoing surveys of your clients, including the joint survey we conducted together around the new year. Can you tell us a bit about who your clients are and some of the biggest takeaways that you've gleaned from your research?
Yeah, thank you very much. It's really great to be here. So thank you again for the invitation. just to give a little bit of background, I think typically small business research tends to lump sort of broad ranges of businesses together. So sometimes that can be businesses up to several $1 million in revenue size. In other cases, that could be businesses anywhere from 0 to 500 employees. We think that that can be problematic because very small businesses and very large businesses often are quite different from one another. And we're seeing that how they reacted to COVID and what it will take to support and ensure what long-term resilience really looks like is quite different. We can move to the next slide, please. Thank you. And since the COVID related lockdown started in March of last year, Start Small's impact assessment team, we've conducted 3 very extensive surveys of all of our active clients to measure and assess the impacts of COVID on our businesses. The first survey that we distributed was in March, just a couple of weeks into the lockdowns. The second survey was in June, 3 months in, and then the most recent survey we completed over the course of 3 months, starting at the end of 2020, and then going through the beginning of 2021. And we did that together with Small Business Majority, and we were able to collect responses from over 1,300 businesses together. The data that Start Small collected I think is unusual in that it focuses specifically on micro businesses. So those with revenues under $100,000, and the entrepreneurs that we surveyed were more likely to be BIPOC and women owned. That's really Start Small's sort of sweet spot. We work with very small businesses and typically those who are under-resourced, so typically Black, Brown, and women-owned businesses, and those who have on average just 1 or 2 employees. As we see from this slide, some of our biggest takeaways from that research is that these micro businesses were able to make some extraordinary pivots and changes to their businesses that allowed them to stay open, even without access to traditional forms of capital, and to a much greater extent than some of their larger counterparts. We also are seeing that access to resources and technical assistance is really what enabled this change. So when we look at our data sets, we can see that as these businesses accessed that individualized and comprehensive assistance that Start Small is providing, and there are other providers out there, but that Start Small was able to provide, there really is this very pronounced drive towards this adaptation and these pivots. So you can see that over 50% of clients who responded to the survey are adding new products and services or establishing or growing an online presence, given the circumstances under which these businesses have been operating. We found that to be quite extraordinary and really very inspiring.
Thank you, Jennifer. And Start Small, Think Big. I just want to, again, just acknowledge you guys have one of the biggest challenges for businesses has been legal, has been how do I, navigate the commercial lease, or what are my options? And so that technical assistance, it has been absolutely critical to survival of small businesses. Brian, I want to turn over to you. Over the last year, Small Business Majority has leveraged both quantitative and qualitative data to understand the impact of the pandemic on small businesses as we gauge policy priorities required for survival. What did we see at the start of the pandemic, and how did that change over time?
Yeah, so we launched a series of surveys of our network beginning in April and started to do them monthly around throughout the pandemic. We interspersed that with a couple of other more nationally representative outside polls, as well as our partnership with Start Small, Think Big. I think some of the key takeaways for us, number one was the challenges that we saw with obtainment and access to PPP and the amount of underfunding. I think these problems have been widely documented. We saw some initial change between April and June of increase, right, of people starting to get it, but then we saw it level out, even as some of these changes were made to try and get more funding into these folks' hands. And I think that we saw those numbers level out in the summer and remain consistent, even as we leverage data to push changes for that program over time. If you want to go to the next slide, Zach. We saw entrepreneurs of color in particular, who comprise about half our sample, were less likely to have received PPP, or if they did receive PPP, were more likely to be funded at a lesser amount. The reasons for this, were well documented. We were glad to see the administration revise the rules for PPP eligibility for sole props, and hope that as many as possible are able to take advantage before the program closes or runs out. If you want to go next slide. One more slide, please. Something we saw too with our survey with Start Small, Think Big was folks were less likely to have accessed funding the smaller the businesses were. Those folks with revenues under 100,000 were about half as likely to get access to PPP funding compared to those over 100,000, and that bears out by size and revenue as well. Next slide, Zach. Another thing we looked at and tracked consistently over the event was, or over the year was businesses' perceived ability to survive up to 3 months, survive the pandemic without additional capital relief. And these were obviously more pronounced for entrepreneurs of color as well, about a third compared to about 25% of white entrepreneurs. And if we look at the next slide, another thing that we looked at that not a lot of people have been looking at are the percent of business owners surveyed who say they're struggling with their commercial rents and mortgages. And we see, a lot of businesses struggling with this even from the beginning and the outset of the pandemic. Next slide. That's it.
So is it fair to say, one of the things that I think has been incredibly helpful and has been meaningful, especially for our work over the last year, as you mentioned, is ensuring that the smallest of small businesses really are able to access the tools and the resource that they need. And so why don't we invite our small business owners to hear from them? I think I want to start with Corissa. Over the last year, as I mentioned at the top, you've not one, not two, but four, and they're different. And, one was a new business, so you haven't been able to access the support and some of the relief that you have for other businesses. So can you just, if you could summarize in a minute and a half or 2 minutes, I know that that's very hard to do, but if you could summarize what this last year has been like for you in navigating this world, I think that would be wonderful.
Well, first off, thank you, Xiomara, and thank you, Small Business Majority, for creating these platforms, educational platforms for small business owners like us, and being at the forefront of advocating for us. I feel like you guys have been the strongest support system for us. I've learned a lot about myself and as a business owner. I know that resiliency has been kind of the motto throughout 2020 in terms of how do I keep mental sanity and keep my team motivated while helping my business survive this. A lot of us small business owners from communities of colors are looking at our businesses as do or die. It's not just us, it's generations that came before us, especially as a daughter of immigrants. It took generations for me to even have the opportunity to own my own business. with one particular business in mind. It was a nightclub prior to pandemic. And so we had to immediately be in the first round of shutdowns. And I think the insensitivity of giving us, I think it was 8 hours of shutdown notice and figuring out what happens from here. And, understanding that, okay, this is going to be really hard and scary, and learning how to pivot that throughout the year. So we went from being a nightclub to now a to-go bar program. And what does that mean? Learning packaging and what holds and what can we deliver, and then getting shut down again, and then having to reopen as a restaurant. And, my bartenders have never served. So how do I train bartenders to now be servers? And how do I learn inventory on food when I've been doing alcohol for so long? And then the cost of goods that encompasses that, and how do I calculate it? And then getting shut down again and having to reopen to now a patio space, and being on the hook for a 2,100 square foot space, but operating in a 500 square foot parklet. And creating a safe space for the community, because at the forefront of what we're doing is making sure that the community is safe, because statistics have shown that Brown and Black communities have suffered the most from COVID-19, keeping my team safe, and then figuring out how do I keep operating as a restaurant. The last shutdown hurt the most because it was 2 days before the holidays. And we had already invested in our inventory, because historically businesses do well, in the restaurant bar industry during the holidays. And yeah, we want to be team players for the community and make sure that the safety of the community is taken into consideration. But I had to furlough over 35 employees right before the holidays. And these are people with families. And how do they go back and explain to their kids that the holidays aren't going to be the same? And, and for us, how do we keep our families motivated when they're seeing us as like their American dream being realized in what we've been able to accomplish? So an interesting year, to say the least.
And it's been particularly rough. I know that you have your businesses in several parts of LA County. Again, you mentioned, having to retrofit establishments. And I think that Chris is also going to talk about some of the consumer behavior that has changed as well. And so that's also something that you have to take into consideration. Renard, you've also had to pivot in order to stay in business. Your business is in Atlanta, Georgia. You have a kickboxing studio, and you had to operate with the health and safety of your customers and staff as a top priority. Tell us about what this last year has looked like for you. And you're on mute.
Thank you for allowing me to be here. You're great organizations doing great things. My first thought was survival, so I was applying for EDO and PPP, and it felt like the applications went to a dark hole. There's no way to track them, no one to call, no one to talk to, so you're not sure if they receive your information or not. Me on a personal level, I went from 185 pounds to 230 to stress eating, stress drinking, constantly up at night, trying to figure out what's the next steps, what I'm going to do. I run a membership martial arts studio, and people was dropping off fast. And my landlord, as great as he allowed me to have that space a year before this happened. So I had construction loans I had to pay back at twice a big facility that was losing half the people there. So it was tough. The EDO advancement, I only received 3,000 when I should receive 10,000. So I was constantly trying to figure how to stay open. Some of the things I did was to consistently communicate with my customers, let them know I'm trying to figure out a way to provide them the services I promised them in a safe way. I looked into PPP, safety equipment. I looked into doing virtual classes. I learned how to do that on the fly. When I think about it, it's funny, I was in the studio by myself talking to a computer, and it felt so weird watching. I had to invest more in bandwidth to help with that too. So I was trying everything I could, and those who did stay with me, because I was offering something of a service online, combined with the EDO finally coming in, and the PPP funding coming in, I had room to breathe, but still had to rebuild because that money went towards just trying to pay off the debts that I owe, so I can still get caught up. When I applied for the second round of PPP, that was a topsy-turvy thing. I did have tracking, but I was rejected 11 times. Same information I thought they were asking for. What was different? So they changed the rules on the definition of payroll costs and all these other things. And they want more information. And luckily, I have an accountant, someone who does my stuff for me. If I didn't have this guy, I don't know what I would have done. But it took me 11 times, talking with a representative of my financial institution 11 times, each one to tell me, oh, you're all set, just submit it, it'll be all great. And within 24 hours, it's not good enough. So very frustrating, trying to pivot, trying to keep your customers happy, trying to provide a service. Again, I expanded to a much more affluent neighborhood, so the rent was much higher. It was tough. When my weight's down, I'm a little more comfortable, but like I always said, I'm cautiously optimistic because I'm waiting for another shutdown, or I'm waiting for when this gets done. The behavior of my consumers, do they like what I'm doing right now? Would they want something different? So I'm just hanging in there, just trying to just take it step by step.
And I think that sentiment around, both of you talked about mental health, and I think Corissa in a previous conversation you talked about like PTSD. You know, like we're still here. It's only been a year. We've reached this mark. We still have a long ways to go. Really excited to hear about the policy recommendations in panel 2, and want to give enough time for that panel to really get into the details on policy. So I do want to just turn it over to Chris. We haven't forgotten about you, Chris. Thank you so much for joining us. We've been talking, and we just heard two business owners. Corissa didn't expand a lot on her financial experience, but she's also come across challenges in accessing PPP. And so as we've talked about these challenges, what surprised you the most about your analysis of business cash flow after the very first round of PPP?
Right. Sure. And again, thank you for inviting me. I'm really happy to be here under the circumstances anyway. So look, I mean, I can tell you what both sort of didn't surprise us and did surprise us, and it's all kind of captured in one slide. So I'm going to try to do one slide and actually stay within 2 minutes or so. So if you go to the next slide. A little bit for context for those who aren't familiar with our organization, our research, the data that we get is from our customers. These are our checking account customers, business checking account customers. So you should think about these as quite small businesses typically. So right in around about that $100,000 range, what we would typically call like a micro employer or a sole prop. And we have the de-identified data on the money going in and out of their accounts and their checking account balances. And so unfortunately, the left side of this chart is not at all surprising. It's definitely the shape we expected to see, and it was disappointing, right? We see revenues going through the floor just along the lines I think that the other panelists are suggesting, right? And because of all the shutdown orders, because even without shutdown orders, people maybe aren't comfortable going out to their small business. This is roughly the kind of pattern we expected to see. Maybe the levels were a little steeper than we expected, where you're seeing revenues come down around 40%, and then cash balances, through March and April going down a huge amount, 20% or so, for the typical small business. The thing that was like surprising and complicated, and I think it's worth trying to read through a little bit, was the progression of the progression of balances up. Like one of the reasons we made this chart at the time that you see it, so this is going through the end of September, was we were really curious from a policy point of view, what we could tell policymakers about how quickly whatever money small businesses had, either through PPP, through other programs, or quite frankly, just cutting back on their expenses, which is a lot of what we also see here, like how long they were going to have that money and how long it was going to last. And we were surprised, quite frankly, to see balance levels up that high through the fall anyway. But the interesting thing that I think even the lines up with some of the stories we just heard was the extent to which, again, like the expenses just stay low even with those high balances. And I very much can empathize with the sense that with all the uncertainty about what was going to happen in the policy environment and what was going to come next, and just from the public health perspective, holding on to those expenses, but not maybe making some of those payments, not doing some of the upkeep, having those obligations to pay rent, leases, et cetera, suppliers, employees even, it's a bit concerning to see the potential for some of the obligations as we sort of look toward this year. You could be worried that there's been some hollowing out of the assets, both real and sort of less tangible as well. So I think that's what we were most surprised by.
And you have one more slide, I believe. Can we just talk about that too real quick? And that was with regards to consumer spending. And I think that we heard from two of our business owners, which have had to pivot in different ways, doing different activities. But as we've continued to, can you tell us a little bit about this online spending that we've
Sure. Yeah. So this is thank you. So this is another piece of research that we've been doing on an ongoing basis, just looking at overall consumer spending on credit and debit cards. This particular lens, I think, is very targeted at local spending, or the kind of spending that might be local. So it's not travel, it's not hotels, but it is like restaurants and dry cleaners and the kinds of things that in particular small businesses are particularly exposed to doing, although it's not just small business spend. There's a lot of things that you can get through these data, which we do publicly release at an aggregate level. But one that I thought was really important for this conversation was just the split between spend in person, what we would call offline spend. So somebody comes into your shop and they swipe a card, versus what's offline, what's online. That could be a remote order, it could be online through a phone or website or something like that. And just the huge divergence and persistent depression in offline spending, which is we see some recovery in overall spending. And so if you don't have this view, you might not totally understand some of the changes that might be a little more persistent and a little bit more relevant to particularly the smallest of small businesses. So I was really interested to see the survey results earlier showing that small businesses tried to make this pivot to online, which I'm sure many have. And a good thing that that they did, because so much spending has shifted online as people have not just been worried about going out, but started to form new patterns of consumption. So again, it's a thing I think we really want to pay attention to, whether or not we're starting to see a divergence between the larger businesses that already had the capital and already had the technology investments to support sort of online on scale, and those that might be a lot more constrained in making those investments, particularly as we go into the next year.
Thank you, Chris. And thank you all for all of your answers. The time just flies when you do these events. You have some questions that you want to get to, but we still have another panel that we definitely want to carve out time for, because we're going to be exploring policy recommendations. And I do want to just very quickly give you all the space to briefly even just share like a word that summarizes this last year. I'll let you think about it, because I know this was a surprise, but a word that summarizes this last year. We explored a lot of concepts in this last panel, from funding gaps to spending habits to other issues that were very relevant as a result of the pandemic. These are things that all of our organizations have had to navigate and support small businesses and in obtaining access to. And one thing that I do want to acknowledge as well is this research has been critical. Congressman Jeffries talked about the shift in really understanding small businesses from a policymaker space. And our organization has seen that there is more drive to try to solve for supporting the small businesses after what has been a very challenging year. So I hope I've given you guys a minute or two to think about a word that summarizes. And I really just want to give this last bit to really Corissa and Renard, because I know that Chris, Jennifer, and Anna Marie will be joining us for panel 2. So Renard and Corissa, I think I've already heard cautiously optimistic as one of those potential. But if you guys want to just close off and just end this panel with just sharing a word that kind of encapsulates this last year and what you're looking forward to maybe in the coming year.
Corissa, go first.
Thank you, Renard. I would say community. Community has really rallied behind us and has inspired us to keep moving forward. We're a staple in the Latinx community. Every time we attempted to reopen, they got behind us, and it was because they saw something of themselves in us. And that meant a lot to us. So community is why we are still here and why we're still pushing forward.
Community, comunidad. Thank you.
Yes,
Renard?
Invictus. It's a poem I live by, where the last line is, I am the captain of my fate. I am the master of my soul.
I love it. I love it. Thank you both so much. Thank you, Brian. Thank you, Chris, Jennifer, and Maria. I know you'll be sticking around for the next panel. At this point, it's my pleasure to turn it over to panel number 2, where we will be exploring policy recommendations necessary. So it's my pleasure to introduce Awesta Sarkash, our Government Affairs Manager, who will be moderating the second panel. Before I turn the mic over to you, Awesta, I just want to briefly acknowledge all of the team members on the Small Business Majority team, the unseen heroes that you're seeing behind the scenes that have been working over the last year, but also on this event. Zach Bellamy, our Director of Engagement, Cassie Mills, our social media manager, and our outreach managers that are also tuning in with us and have brought you all partners to today's event. Awesta, thank you.
Thanks, Theo, and thank you all again for joining us. Thank you to our panelists, especially Renard and Corissa. I'm going to shift to our second panel. It's where we go from here, unlocking transformative and bold change through short-term and long-term policy. I want to introduce 2 new panelists, each with very distinguished careers, and then we can jump straight into questions. First, one of Small Business Majority's really close allies and supporters, Kylie Patterson, who is an accomplished programs director, author, researcher, and public policy analyst. Her drive and commitment to economic equity led to her appointment as a professional staff member on the U.S. Senate Committee on Small Business and Entrepreneurship. Majority staff. On the committee, Kylie researches and drafts legislation to support businesses owned by Black, Indigenous, and people of color, women, veterans, those with disabilities, and those in underserved and rural communities. Prior to her appointment to the U.S. Senate, Kylie served as the Director of Economic Inclusion at Johns Hopkins University and led programs and evaluations to address racial and income inequality at Prosperity Now, BCT Partners, the City of Minneapolis, Pew Charitable Trusts, and the AFL-CIO, among others. Also joining us is Scott Hereford, White House liaison and with the Small Business Administration. Prior to joining SBA, he worked on the Biden campaign as the South Carolina political director. And after the primary election, he became the Southeastern political director for the Biden-Harris campaign. And then before joining the campaign, Scott worked in South Carolina's 1st Congressional District as a senior field director for Congressman Joe Cunningham, and worked on Representatives James Smith and Mandy Powers Norrell's campaign for governor, lieutenant governor of South Carolina as the deputy political director. Also very notably, Scott started a small business that focused on hydroponic farm development and consulting. So we're definitely in really company. I'm going to just sort of jump into some questions here aimed at having a conversation about what policies and tangible recommendations we can discuss that will better support our small businesses, especially entities that we've really been focused on this call, women, entrepreneurs of color, and underserved businesses. So I'm going to pitch this question to both Kylie and Scott, and maybe Kylie, you can take a first stab at it. But my question to you, Kylie, and then Scott after, is in seeing the data that you've sort of witnessed in the previous panel, what policies and measures should have already been in place before the pandemic that might have addressed barriers in accessing capital once the relief programs had been rolled out?
Sure. And again, thank you so much for the invitation, and thank you to all the distinguished panelists today and all the distinguished small businesses on the call. Thank you so much for your time. The first thing I wanted to draw everyone's attention to is what has been the Section 1071 of the Dodd-Frank Act. And so just so for those who aren't familiar, the Section 1071 was to require all financial institutions to compile, maintain, and submit to the Bureau certain data on applications for credit for women-owned, minority-owned, and small businesses. So as I'm sure you all recall, Dodd-Frank at this point feels a little bit old. But that particular section has yet to be fully executed. And even now, it's not yet fully executed. And it was not until there was a lawsuit filed that real attention was brought to it. So that's one thing that was on the books, but had not been fully executed, that I think would have at least given us the data to know that there were these gaps in the market. Additionally, another area would have been our support and our funding of the Cdfi fund. What we found was that even as we knew that these community development financial institutions that Congressman Jeffries alluded to earlier had a better ability to reach out to communities and communities of color, they didn't always have all the lending capital required to make those types of loans. So it's so important that, and we're still staying the course, that, the fight's not over, but those are two pieces of legislation that I think if we had it fully executed would have helped to address the access to capital. And the last piece I'll share is around partnering with community-based organizations. I know that there's some small business development centers on the call. Thank you so much for your work. But I think moreover, what we need to do is we need to make sure that the SBA, the MBDA, that all of us are being extra proactive in talking to small business organizations and community organizations, because they really, and faith-based organizations, because they really are kind of the first line out there. So I think that's one other thing that's always been a commitment and legislatively to compel and encourage SBA to do that. But I think there's always more to be done. Thank you.
Thanks, Kylie. Scott, any input here?
Yeah, just a quick follow-up, and again, thank you for inviting me, and I feel honored to be on this panel with this group and in front of these business owners. I think Kylie hit it when she said that we need to be connecting with business owners, business groups to get the word out. But there's also a funding piece, right? But before the pandemic, the SBA's fund was about $40 billion. Then essentially overnight, we're in control of almost $1 trillion of relief and aid and programs that we're scheduled to get out. Historically, the SBA hasn't been prioritized in terms of funding and administrative staff. So there, I think as Congressman Jeffries mentioned earlier, we faced some unexpected adversity when it came to making sure funds were distributed timely and equitably. But to agree with Kylie, there should have been a bigger effort on some of the marketing for the SBA. I think before the pandemic, there was a large universe of business owners who weren't sure what the SBA did or how it could help them. But now you ask a business owner about SBA, I'm sure you'll get a variety of responses, but they know who we are. And I'm sure we'll touch on it later, but there's a lot that needs to be done to make sure that people know about the SBDCs, people know about the 68 district offices that we have across the country, because there's consulting, our district offices and other partners can help with business development plans, find creative avenues to access SBA capital and other capital with some of our lending partners. So I think, the awareness marketing piece, but also I think the SBA, as it is now, is we're kind of growing into a little bit bigger mission. And that should also be prioritized when it talks about, just the overall budget and funding of the agency.
Thanks, Scott. Yeah, that is a really good point. And we have a ton of SBDCs on this call, and they've done such important work over the course of the pandemic and certainly beforehand as well. We've been talking a lot about closing disparities, closing gaps, and all this sorts of things. And one of the things that, I think most people would hope or had hoped is trying to look at sort of the rollout of these programs through a racial equity lens. And so Kylie, and of course, Scott, feel free to jump in as well. Kylie, I'd love to know if you think that there are bipartisan approaches for the way Congress can sort of take on policymaking with a racial equity lens.
Yes, absolutely. And I think, one thing that we know for sure is that small businesses have historically been a bipartisan issue. It's something where, Republican, Democrat alike, we want to make sure that we're supporting our small businesses. But I think one thing to keep in mind as we grow into a nation where we have larger populations of people of color, what we're going to find is that if we don't do this, we're going to be losing our competitive edge. This is not just about an altruistic mission. It is about business. And the fact is that we have literally left millions of jobs on the table and billions of revenue unclaimed because of our lack of investment in communities of color in rural areas, et cetera, and in women and veterans. So I think in terms of the opportunity ahead of us, it's just that. It's making sure that when we have these conversations, we're not, we lead with an understanding that, yes, everyone has been impacted by discrimination, white supremacy, and racism differently. And we need to make sure that as we move ahead, that we are doing this with an eye towards equity, because that will ultimately lead for more economic viability for all of us, and for America to be, the nation that so many of us, love to be, love and it has made so much opportunity for all of us in terms of our business needs. And to that point, I just want to lift up one thing. And so we are looking at, for instance, making the Community Advantage program permanent, or at very least extending it. Right now, it's scheduled to end in September 2022. And this is a program where we are working with CDFIs and community development corporations and others to provide lending capital. And it has among the best data in terms of its ability to support small businesses and those run by people of color. So I think that that's something that we're hopeful we will have some bipartisan support to achieve this Congress, so that way we can meet that cliff really, and making sure that remains available for small businesses across the nation.
Thanks, Kylie. I really liked your point about the fact that closing these disparity gaps and so on is going to be good and essential for everybody. Everyone's going to benefit off of it. We're leaving a lot of jobs and money on the table. Scott, I think probably a lot of folks on this call are really interested to know what the administration is doing to ensure small businesses are on a path to recovery, and whether they're taking the approach of approaching these recommendations and so on with an equity lens.
Definitely, that's a great question. As was mentioned earlier from some of the small business owners, we know that small businesses are struggling, from the small sole proprietors to those medium businesses with a few hundred employees, and there have been from the start it wasn't perfect, but just like anything new, we're constantly taking feedback and trying to perfect the system. When it comes to PPP, there was just a recent extension of the program that ends now on May 31st. And we've also made some updates to the program, prioritizing some of our smallest business owners, sole proprietors, self-employed business owners, independent contractors, so they can also receive that same support. We've also loosened up some of the, when we talk about kind of equity lens and opportunity, we've loosened up some of the qualifiers for the program. Now entrepreneurs with non-fraud felony convictions, if folks that have been delinquent or default on their federal student loans, they now qualify for PPP. Also non-citizen small business owners now have access to the program using their identified individual taxpayer identification number. So when we talk about access to capital and making sure that communities of color are prioritized, that's something that we are, that Administrator Guzman has put at the forefront of the agency. And we talk about how to get there, right? I think, Kyle, you mentioned it earlier. One of the programs that we'll be launching is a pilot program called the Community Navigator program, which has been funded through the American Rescue Program, which will allow the SBA to partner with community-based organizations that can act as a bridge between the community and the federal government, the Small Business Association, to help those business owners that might not have that traditional structure or resources that other businesses might have, but they can still participate in some of the programs. And as Renard mentioned earlier, the process hasn't been easy, but we're hoping that with programs like the Community Navigator program, it'll help bridge the gap and make sure that there's an equitable approach to distributing and access to some of the relief funds that we plan on rolling out. And in addition to that, we've also kind of honed in and added a few programs. Just today, the Shuttered Venues Operating Grant came live online. You can go to the SBA's website and apply for those $16 billion worth of funds that are available. In addition to that, the SBA is in the process of rolling out the Restaurant Revitalization Fund that will give $28 billion for restaurants, food trucks, food carts to help them on their way to recovery.
Scott, thank you. Just a follow-up question there, because we have so many business organizations on. I'm assuming these entities should just sort of stay up to date with SBA as you guys roll out the Community Navigator pilot program, correct?
Yeah, we're still working on that. We will be, as you know, it's starting from the ground up, but we will be releasing some more information later this month on that program.
Great, good to know. And one other question for you, Scott. Looking beyond some of these federal relief programs and thinking more long-term, it would be great to know what sort of we can expect from the administration that would support entrepreneurs and small business owners beyond sort of the short term and the immediate.
Right. Great question. I think, right now we're in the response recovery mode. But soon we'll be beginning to shift towards the building and recouping stage of this recovery. And as we're doing that, the Administrator Guzman has put equity and business owners of color and from minority backgrounds at the forefront. As President Biden and Vice President Harris have said before, equity is essential for building a stronger country for us all. And what that means for us at the SBA, the administrator has tasked us with making sure that, the issues that Renard mentioned, making sure that the process doesn't stop small businesses from getting access to capital. We're looking at all of the programs and services that we offer and thinking about how we can make them more accessible to entrepreneurs without that traditional support system, without that, accountant that can help them navigate the process, or such as a language barrier. And we're doing that in multiple ways. I think, we put together a diverse staff at the SBA, not only from a racial standpoint, but from a background standpoint. We've got Corissa. We have our assistant administrator for field operations. She is a former brewery owner and operator. So she understands what business owners have been going through, and we're using her firsthand experience to help us craft these policies. But we're also taking the approach that business owners take, right? You listen to your customers, and we've been doing the same thing. We've been holding a series of roundtables with groups such as the Urban League, small business owners, to get feedback from the community on what they would like to see in some of these programs that we're going to roll out. And I think things like that will be key to helping us eliminate the opportunity gap and access to capital. Because like it was mentioned earlier, if folks don't have that access to capital, that's where a lot of ideas get left on the cutting room floor. And we need to be more like the businesses we serve, listen to our customers, and implement that moving forward. So I think you'll see a lot of innovative approaches coming out of the administration. Don't have any direct policy to reference now, but just know that the mindset of the SBA is changing, and we're becoming more customer focused.
Absolutely. Thank you, Scott. And really helpful to hear that you guys are having, former small business owners like yourself being part of the conversation, so they understand firsthand how to approach these policy measures, both short and long term. I have a question for Anna Marie. How can some of the other practitioners and stakeholders on this call leverage the data in your map to improve business outcomes in the communities that we've talked about?
Sure, thank you. Just to preface again, the mapping tool, it was really intended for practitioners, for policymakers. So you are all in mind for the data that's been included here, but also the way in which you can utilize it. And basically, this map is meant for you to be able to drill down neighborhood by neighborhood and even filter by business to identify those interventions that would be critical to, again, helping businesses and neighborhoods remain resilient or survive the pandemic. So in a very practical term, you can go to the map and identify those neighborhoods and identify those interventions.
Great. One follow-up question for you. ICIC released a policy brief about a comprehensive approach to combating poverty. What should policymakers consider when supporting small businesses in these communities, in your opinion?
Yes, we developed 6 key areas of priorities, and many of them I'm sure you've assumed to be the case, even from today's conversation in terms of economic assistance, making sure that that is available to highly vulnerable neighborhoods. Additionally, making sure that not only businesses, but also employees are assisted, especially in those industries that have been highly affected by the crisis. The one thing that I haven't been hearing a lot of is access to affordable internet access or internet services, which is now not only a necessity for businesses that are obviously pivoting to online e-commerce, but also for education and telehealth, different types of access to public services. Another key area is making affordable health insurance universal. And then also making housing affordability a top priority. And then finally, looking at vaccine distribution, particularly in highly vulnerable neighborhoods where those residents may not have access to the internet. We know that some of the vaccine appointments are only being conducted via online appointment portals. So having additional outreach strategies that may involve folks being on the ground to educate and also make vaccine distribution highly accessible.
Thank you. Another question here for Jennifer. From what we've learned, how can we think more creatively about how the smallest businesses access capital and gain specialized support to help them with their pivoting?
Sorry. Thank you. I think that, as we've all been talking about, small businesses are going to need to make just extreme changes in order to survive. And they're going to have to make those changes at much greater relative cost and with significantly less working capital than most larger businesses. And I think at the root of what comes next is really more and better collaboration across multiple sectors to keep our businesses afloat. I feel like this is a theme that we've been talking about, but it's really what I would call sort of whole ecosystem building. And from our perspective, that's really access to creative capital, combined with really individualized and comprehensive TA support. And we've heard various panelists touch on this and at different points throughout today. I think part of this is recognizing that every entrepreneurial ecosystem is unique. So what works in New York may not work the same as it does in Fresno, but that there's still important learnings, best practices, challenges that need to be shared, and that successful ecosystems include participation from the businesses themselves and TA providers, local governments, funders, but that entrepreneurs need access to creative capital and that individualized and comprehensive TA support, and that we have to identify and remove as many points of friction for them to get connected to both of those resources at the same time, and really allow partners to cross-refer to one another as quickly as possible. I think the sort of call to action there is really looking at funders, and looking at government, particularly at the local levels, who have tremendous power to really meaningfully support bringing those two pieces of this ecosystem together. And at this point, it is that creative capital and this very individualized TA support that have proven themselves to be essential to this really inclusive recovery.
Thanks, Jennifer. Yeah, I really liked your, you used the word ecosystem a lot. And I think the business organizations that are on here are really an instrumental component to our small business ecosystem, and a lot of what you've talked about technical assistance as well. Chris, a question for you. As we look to advance solutions that help us rebuild our economy more equitably, what should policymakers be considering in light of the research that you've shared with us today on small business and the wealth gap?
I think it's a really good question. And it's funny, I was still sort of thinking about Tamara's question from the end of the last panel, where she asked for sort of one word to summarize. And my word, I feel like that I've been carrying around with me for the last year, has been targeting. And so when I think about what's worked, I mean, quite frankly, about some of the more recent adjustments of policy has been that attentiveness to the small businesses that maybe would benefit the most from policy action, right? I think sort of the sector as a whole, as compared to larger businesses, often can sort of use the greatest support. I take it this is a little bit your point, Scott, that the small business sector and then the SBA in particular could get a little bit more attention by way of that. But within that, I think what we've seen across our research, both in the last year, but even more to the point, throughout the last 6-7 years, has been the meaningful gaps between women-owned businesses and male-owned businesses, Black and Latinx-owned businesses and white-owned businesses. So to the extent that we're looking to address those gaps on a go-forward basis, coming out hopefully, in July out of the pandemic, really the opportunity to take whatever funding we can put against the problem and target it to the kinds of businesses, to the communities, to the industries, just across the board, to not kind of take a one-size-all brush to the problem and really focus, use data as best as we can to understand how to get the most out of each dollar, I think can make a huge difference. It's a big gap to close. Can you close it all through small business action? Probably not, right? There's many households whose wealth isn't necessarily touched by small business. And so I don't want to kind of, put the entirety of wealth gap closing on the small business sector, but just the same, whether it's small business or household policy, really being thoughtful about the way to get the most out of each dollar, I think could make a huge difference.
Thanks. Good points there. Well, I want to close out this panel by just asking Kylie and Scott, for the business organizations that are joining us today, what sort of guidance would you give them as they sort of help small businesses navigate the rest of this pandemic and looking forward? Just any sort of informal insights you have there. Kylie, I'll start with you.
Sure, and I should have said this earlier, but I just want to say too that on behalf of Chairman Cardin, he sees you and he thanks you so very much for all the work that you're doing in your communities. What I would say is, and this is just an informal thing, but it's so true. If ever you have a doubt in terms of what the newest policy is, I would encourage you to Google or Bing SBA PPP or SBA EIDL or whatever else, IFR. And that stands for interim final rule. And that will tell you the most up to date. You can certainly, if you choose, read, some of our legislative text that we spend so much time agonizing over. It's 600, 700 pages sometimes on occasion. But the best place I would say is IFR. And oftentimes your questions can be quickly answered by what the SBA has compiled for you. So that's just a quick thing. One other thing I would say too is that the shuttered venue operators grant program was opened today at noon. So please go. I dropped the link in the chat, but I would not be surprised if some of those venue operators are already starting to reach out to you. So just so you are also aware of the status of that. And then lastly, what I would say is that I'll give you an update that we're continuing to explore and work with our Republican colleagues on some bipartisan solutions when it comes to Paycheck Protection Program, because we understand that that there still are some what appears to be gaps in terms of the Paycheck Protection Program for some types of small business owners. So just giving you that like wink and a nod. Now, not saying that anything's actually going to happen right now, but we're definitely trying to have those conversations to make that program even better and stronger for all the small businesses out there.
Thanks, Kylie. Scott, any sort of guidance you would give to these business orgs that are on right now?
Yeah, I mean, I'd first want to tell them thank you. Thank you for the work that you've been doing to inform the businesses on the call. I'd like to tell the business owners that we're listening. And shifting back to the organizations, please use us as a resource. The SBDCs, the district offices, the regional offices, we are here to help. Please, if you can't find it online, feel free to send an email, pick up the phone call, and we'll help you figure out the problem. I know that there needs to be more of an effort on our end to make sure that these resources are widely known, but we're working on that. And just continue to lean on us as much as possible, and just know that more help is on the way.
Thank you, Scott and Kylie, so much, and to the rest of our panelists as well. I'm going to turn it over to Zio now.
Wow, we have gone through an hour and a half. I can't believe it. 90 minutes just flies like that. Zach, if you wouldn't mind, there's one key takeaway slide. If we can pull that up, that would be great. Want to just thank you all for your time, again, tuning in and listening from our panelists. Thank you to the panelists for joining us. Really, our goal for this event was to display some of the research that has been shared over the last year that has been critical for policy recommendations and the changes that have been explored and designed to happen. We know that research will continue to play that critical role in designing policy solutions that are pragmatic around key business issues. We really focused on finance, but I'm glad that Anna Marie brought up issues of broadband. Congressman Jeffries brought up issues of healthcare. I mean, these are all the issues that we're talking about. These are complex issues, but research really does help drive forward the plethora of recommendations that we can make. We are also going to continue to explore collaborative research opportunities to capture a wide data set and small business set. So similar to the research project that we launched with Start Small, Think Big. And I know we're going to put up some polls or have a survey for you all to share some input on whether you'd be interested in participating in some of that collaborative research to capture a wider data set. We also will be looking to convene resource sharing through education and outreach work. This is part of the ecosystem building that Jenny and others have referenced. Ecosystem building can happen when we are convened, when we're working collaboratively as we have done over the last year and years. Another key takeaway was to continue to elevate the voices of diverse business groups and business owners through media and storytelling. We heard from some of our partners here. We heard from some of the business owners here. Small businesses have moved into the #1 trusted messenger slot as of last year. This is because they're pillars in our community. And as the more we can do to elevate those voices, we will be shifting the discussion and the narrative around the type of support that they need. And lastly, I think, again, a strengthening of the ecosystem to provide scalable technical assistance programming to support rebuilding efforts. Business owners will be served when they know about some of the secrets or the best kept secrets like the SBDCs or the SBA, and that shouldn't be the case. And so again, our Venturize platform is trying to help raise some awareness, but there's more work to be done to ensure that our ecosystem is strong for small business owners to gain the resources and tools that they need. With that, again, I want to be respectful of everyone's time. I hope that this event was helpful for a good discussion and did provide some access to new data that you might have not seen before. We will be sharing a link to replay or revisit this event, as well as some of the tools that were mentioned. We'll share the link that Anna Marie shared on the map. We'll have a brief survey as well. We don't want this to end. Definitely want to continue to be hosting more events geared toward partners. I think you always see our programming for small businesses, but it's nice to have a space with us all convening. And so with that, really just want to appreciate you all for tuning in, the Small Business Majority team for working on this event, and all of the panelists for joining us today. Thank you so much.